Picture this, our first mini pod about After the Hunt and why Rotten Tomatoes is dangerous. Let's get into it.
Welcome to Picture This, the podcast where we examine the weekly box office and ask what do movie-going trends say about American culture.
I'm Dave. Over the last 10 years, I've worked for a filmmaker, an agent, and at a movie studio in movie marketing.
And I'm Max, a screenwriter and son of an independent movie theater owner who has spent his whole life in love with the movies. Today, we are hopping on because Dave has some thoughts about After the Hunt and the critical response to it.
Thanks, Max. I appreciate you hopping on, man. This is outside of our regularly scheduled programs for sure. But this is something that you and I talked about in our fall preview episode a little bit ago. This movie, After the Hunt, which, as a reminder, is directed by Luca Guadagnino. Screenplay was by Nora Garrett. It stars Julia Roberts, Ayo Edebiri, who's from The Bear, Andrew Garfield, who's from Spider-Man, to Martin Scorsese's The Silence, just about anything you should know. And we talked about this episode a couple weeks ago because it's an interesting filmmaker and it's very interesting subject matter. The premise is, on a college campus, Julia Roberts plays a professor who is close friends with Andrew Garfield, another professor, and close with her TA, played by Ayo Edebiri. And there is a he said, she said sexual misconduct that happens between the Ayo Edebiri character and the Andrew Garfield character. And Julia Roberts doesn't know what happened, and she's caught in the middle. Max, I was excited about it because based on the trailer and what I'd heard about it, it takes on a lot of different issues that are hot button issues in our society today.
Yeah, and it also just attracted multiple high-level talent. You know, the assumption therein is like there's something very interesting about the way that they're approaching it is. I actually had feedback from one of our listeners that said when we did the fall preview that this was her most anticipated movie that we talked about as well. I haven't made it out yet, but you saw it, Dave, and you have some spice to throw around.
I sure did, yeah, and I want to talk about it. The reason we're hopping on is the backdrop of what it looks like from an outsider's perspective on RottenTomatoes.com.
Yeah.
But first, let's quickly talk about the movie. On our fall preview episode, we also included this idea of like degree of difficulty. And this one, I think we gave our highest degree of difficulty because the purpose of the film in many ways is taking up hot button issues in our society today. Actually, you and I talked about it, like most movies that go this specific and head on to these issues rarely can land the plane. And this movie talks about sex and sexual misconduct and sexual violence. It also brings up things like class, talks about race, and it also talks about age. And in our three leads, we see the three generations. We see Julia Roberts representing the boomer generation, Andrew Garfield representing the millennial generation, and Ayo representing the Gen Z generation. Light spoilers for After the Hunt. We're not going to get into the nitty gritty, but I am going to allude to some things in it. The movie overall doesn't work.
Okay.
However,
not the spicy take I thought you were going to come with. Okay.
Still, the movie is great and really interesting to watch. The performances, especially by Julia Roberts, is excellent. The art direction and the cinematography and the editing are all really interesting. Luca, the director, makes really interesting choices. He makes his characters all very well rounded. No one's perfect. And the first hour of it, I found myself being so enraptured in the world that he was creating. He very clearly sets it in a place. It very specifically takes place on Yale's campus. And then in the first opening sequence, you get to meet Julia Roberts and what kind of professor on campus she is. You meet Ayo Edebiri and understand her as a TA, how she's enamored by Julia Roberts and devoted to her. And Garfield has an interesting relationship with both Julia and Julia's husband, as well as Ayo. So it really paints this awesome picture of this like complex web of relationships.
Yeah, and you're like dropped in the world. You understand everything very clearly, very quickly. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah.
I mean, there's some solid craft done just by executing that. Then, like, that's
absolutely
valuable to watch.
Exactly, and like I really found myself on the edge of my seat for the first hour, and then. For me, as the incident occurs and then this exploration of he said, she said, how does Julia Roberts play into it?
Is Julia centered Is her character the center of the film?
She's the center and the core of the film, and is essentially stuck between not just two people that she is close with. She has genuinely strong relationships with Io and Andrew's characters, but
Mm-hmm.
also her own position at the college and how this incident could affect like her own trajectory as a professor in that world. So all those nuances are like I think really interesting and very very specific.
Yeah.
There are also these conversations and reflection on what Julia and her boomer generation thinks about IO and the Gen Z generation. And that also mirrors, Max, the fact that you and I are two getting older dudes,
Yeah.
cis white dudes, and have our perspective. And that's talked about pretty bluntly in the film, as well as the female perspective, and why Gen Z maybe hates on millennials and boomers, and maybe why we deserve some shade too.
It's also just like as a what would you call it, like the core emotional challenge that the filmmakers are putting onto the audience is this nightmare scenario of being the person who is caught in the middle of this, and there's no good decision, no good outcome. What do? You don't have the answers, you don't have access to the truth, maybe you'll never ever find it out. Like, that's a fucking pretty shitty place to be. And then also on top of that, like you're saying, how our own perspectives and biases and our age and all that other stuff informs how we confront something like that and the challenges that come off of that. I mean, that's all like fucking pretty interesting stuff.
I think so too, man. And I think that's why I was on our fall preview list. But this one felt unique in the type of topics and themes it was going to take on. But like I said, man, these movies, it's really hard to stick the landing. And then it does not stick the landing. It like the last half hour, it just starts to falter. And from what I have read over the last couple of days, I have seen a lot of critics also agree that that is an element that the movie just doesn't work. However, leaving it, I had a really interesting conversation with my wife about about her perspective on sexual violence and being a female in this world of potential sexual abuse, and then my perspective. And we talked about it way more than many other movies that I drag her to see, even though the movie, quote unquote, didn't work. So now I did want to mention to you this Rotten Tomatoes thing, which I know, Max, you have an opinion on it, and I'd love to quickly talk about it here. But looking on Rotten Tomatoes, so Rotten Tomatoes, I'm sure many people know, but it is an aggregator of many critical reviews of any film, and then they quantify it into a percentage. And a lot of people now have taken that percentage and used it. When I worked at a movie studio in movie marketing, I worked on many campaigns where we literally throw whatever that number was into a television spot or a social asset because it has equity, where people now see that number and make an assumption on if the movie is good or bad. And
yeah, they really lean hard into the Rotten Tomatoes specifically, and not the other. There's a couple of other aggregates. You always hear me on this podcast talking about Letterboxd, but like Metacritic, which my dad, as a movie theater owner, was always harping on as a little bit more accurate. The Rotten Tomatoes thing has become what Ain't It Cool News was at one point, and what like certain critics in the past used to be revered as the standard bearer.
yeah. And I think it's worth acknowledging that, okay, all our lives are busy, especially if you're not enamored with movies the way that Max and I are. So I understand nowadays it is helpful to have cheat codes and ways of saving time. But I think it's worth saying on Rotten Tomatoes, even after this quick review of the film, going on Rotten Tomatoes has this as a score of 34% for
Whoa.
and a 30, slightly higher for critics at a 39%. Max, let me quickly tell you some other Rotten Tomato scores that have scored in the 30s over the last couple of years. Ready?
Okay.
Paul Blart Mall Cop 2, uh, The Emoji Movie, and Will Smith's movie After Earth. These are just three movies that have similar scores to After the Hunt, which that's what sparked me to come on this. The thing about Rotten Tomatoes is that it flattens the view of a movie. And I think it can be a great detriment to the movie. Let me share with you quickly how Rotten Tomatoes comes up with their score.
I have a basic idea of this. They essentially give it like a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So like everything the critic says in their review, they either give it a fresh rating or a rotten rating. But what I don't understand is how they determine by looking at that review, whether it's written in Variety or the Kansas City Herald or whatever, how they really determine that.
I think the big thing to mention is that the Rotten Tomato score is not taking every critic that's listed, and that critic doesn't look at a movie and they don't rate that movie from 1 to 100. It's not
right.
every single critic gave this movie a 70 or a 10, and then the average of all those critics scores ends up being this 34% that we had said. So to clarify, what it is instead is all these critics will write long form, just like the way we're potting about stuff. They'll write a review on it and they'll have nuance in it. And I like to think, and what I've read, like many critics have said, there's some good, there's some bad in this. But ultimately, what Rotten Tomatoes does is it takes that review and it flattens it out to just be like, okay, this article from this journalist, is he saying this movie is good or bad? And it's either it's a yes or a no. We're in this data driven world of it's a one or a zero.
Yeah.
And then therefore you end up with this 39% or 34%, which vastly misses all the nuance of a movie, which is like my great frustration. After the Hunt, though it has a lot of flaws, man, is it asking some really interesting questions. And yet, my assumption is people that don't have a lot of time and just don't have the time to live in the nuance. They'll go on Rotten Tomatoes. They're going to see that this is a 39%. And they're going to be like, I'm good. I'm past. I hear it's bad. I'm never going to see it.
Yeah. I always encourage folks to avoid Rotten Tomatoes. I'm peeking at the Metacritic right now. And the thing about Metacritic that I like a little bit better is it does give you an actual number from 1 to 100. And then you click on the actual movie and it shows you the variety of scores that it got. So if you click on After the Hunt, this is really interesting. They have critics that are giving it 100, as high as 70. Then you see a lot of like stuff in the middle, 50, 60. And then like it goes all the way down to 10. So you got a movie here that ranges from 10 to 100. The user score on it is actually a 7.5, which would, if that was on a scale of 100, that'd be 75 out of 100. And it's radically different than the user score on Rotten Tomatoes. And then if you look at the Letterboxd stuff, it has an overall 3.0 out of 5, which is a 60%. And then if you look at the actual, there's like something like 14,000 reviews on this, which is why I like Letterboxd, is the sample size is so large, and it's by people who like movies, although they gave Superman incredibly high ratings, and you know how I feel about that. But if you look at that one, yeah, it's got a 3.0 out of 5, which is technically not strong in the world of Letterboxd. But if you look at the individual reviews, you have 4-star reviews, 5-star reviews, 1-star reviews, 2.5-star reviews, all of which really indicates that this is a very interesting movie.
I agree. And I think it's funny you brought up Superman, Max, because I will quickly go back to After the Hunt, and I'm almost done with that, I promise. But I think there's something about this subject matter that puts it in a precarious place in the American movie-going audience that Max, you and I love to talk about.
Right.
My theory is that a movie like this that takes on issues of class, race. I didn't mention that Io Debree's character, she's the student in the film. She's the TA. She's Io Debree, who's black. But she comes from a very wealthy family, and they make that known in the story. And the Andrew Garfield professor comes from a very working class background. He defines himself as like he's worked so hard to get to this place, and this Io character comes from a lot of money and privilege. And what does that mean? So it's taking on class, race, age, sex. Like it's taken on all of it. And then my theory is that like audiences either look for a movie like that to be like painfully realistic and probably very depressing, or frankly, which I would define as kind of like the movie Eddington, which we talked about, which is like very realistic, taking on themes and pretty painful and depressing. Or audiences want the Superman route, which is like we talked about this in that movie. They're like they make allusions to Israel-Palestine things, but they don't try to
the billionaire people operating above the laws, but it's just not really deeply explored. It's just like, hey, we all agree this is bad, right? Yeah, well, exactly. We took a stand and said it was bad.
And I guess to that point, in this theory, Max, I think audiences other than Max Kessler can tolerate that version of it.
Literally, like every day I meet somebody else who really liked that movie, and I'm just so happy about it.
Or they want something super real. And I think this movie ultimately ended up just kind of being in between. It starts to talk about it in a serious way, but Luca Guadagnino, he's a very like flourishy director. Like he kind of adds a little bit of melodrama to it. So I think some people would be like, oh, you didn't make it real enough. You're not being true to this. Or people are being like, oh, it was not fun enough and not entertaining. So he was kind of stuck in the middle on that.
I mean, even the challengers, people are like, I'm not exactly sure what he was saying.
Yeah.
But like there's a lot of interesting things explored there. So that was kind of my thought when we talked about this on fall preview. Is this going to be so ambiguous and not take a side that it's going to just kind of confuse and upset audiences. But you're saying it really just kind of didn't stick the landing.
Yes, I think if you watch the first hour, it raises a lot of interesting questions, and there are conversations in the movie that say really interesting and sometimes really mean and scathing, and maybe even some really truthful things about the age groups smashed together against each other. You know, both sexes smashed together against each other. It's like it's very interesting, and no, it doesn't solve it. We as a society have not solved these race issues, class issues, sex issues. So like I like the expectation that this movie should have solved it, I think is unfair. It could have finished the movie better. Like again, the headline is the movie probably doesn't work. However, Max, all the things you were talking about, services outside of Rotten Tomatoes, what I think I just wanted to mention, which is find other more nuanced ways to get advice on movies. I think we said on the last episode specifically, like, don't just look for the aggregate score. Find critics, find podcasters, whether it's us or other people that you agree with and maybe share insight into it. But I would just strongly encourage you not to solely just look at a score on Rotten Tomatoes and be like, well, Rotten Tomatoes says it's a 41, because some of my favorite movies have a Rotten Tomato score of 59 or
Yeah.
58 or 62. And those are the ones that I think are most interesting, but I think general audiences will sometimes just let it pass them by.
Yeah, there's also just a thing, and we forget about it, but sometimes movies at the time they come out, they either get panned by critics or they get real lukewarm response by critics. And then over time, they become very, very beloved. There also have been, in the past, specifically with Rotten Tomatoes, payola scandals where it's been exposed that certain critics are paid to give positive reviews, fresh-looking reviews to movies in order to boost their performance at the box office. And it's my personal opinion that that shit's happening widely, rampantly, and aggressively.
Mm-hmm.
I can't prove that. It's based solely on just my feelings about seeing certain movies get, like, movies that are kind of universally hated getting pretty good reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, and the audience score being so distant from the critic score. Again, it really varies movie to movie, but some of these like wide market 4-quadrant movies that are coming out that the studios knows are going to be bad, and then they get like really high ratings on Rotten Tomatoes, and knowing that there have been payola scandals in the past, you're like, this feels awfully suspicious to me. Yeah. So whatever, I'm a little bit on my conspiracy theory, Mike, at this point, but I 100% think that that happens sometimes, which is another reason why I like to check Letterboxd, which is also, you know, it's not 100% accurate. The main thing that's wrong with Letterboxd is what a 3-star rating means to one person can be completely different than a 3-star rating to another person. Mm-hmm. But because you get something like at least 10,000 reviews per movie over the aggregate, you get a pretty good idea of how movie-going fans feel about the movie. So I encourage people to check there. You can do a real cursory, what's the average rating on this movie, much like a fresher Rotten that you get at Rotten Tomatoes. And once you start checking over the course of a couple months and you compare it with how you felt about movies, you can know that, like, I like any movie that's generally above a 3.2. Or if you're like a little bit of a snob like me, it might have to get closer to a 3.6 for you to consider it good. Or you might know that, like, the movie's just bad and you're going to like it or whatever. But you can do the shallow dive like you can do on Rotten Tomatoes, or you could do a deep dive and you could crack it open and look at what people are saying and why they're saying it and kind of decide for yourself.
Yeah, I'd go one further than that, Max. Again, I think knowing that we're in a world where we can't get rid of not quantifying film and art in some capacity, my advice would be, like, find whatever method of quantification that you wanna lean into. I would suggest maybe like 3 different voices that you generally trust and hear what they say about it. Maybe if the movie got a crap Rotten Tomato score and all, say, 3 of those critics that I trust panned it, then maybe that's something to dismiss. But if there's a long form where some of these trusted critics say that there's something interesting about it, I would trust it. And you know what? Maybe a dream of mine is that, like, I hope Max and I can be a voice for some people out there.
Yeah.
And so I think this is a pod to just say to people, like, be careful what you're trusting as far as people telling you what's good or bad.
Yeah, I mean, my overall thing is don't listen to the critics. And I'm a victim of this too. There's a couple of, like, him was on my most anticipated movies list. It got this really weird response. I wouldn't even say necessarily bad, although it wasn't great, but it just kind of, it deprioritized seeing the movie for me, and now I missed it in theaters, right?
Mhm.
And if I just didn't listen to critic and didn't listen to feedback and watch the trailers about the movies that I thought were interesting and went to go see them, in my experience, that's generally a really great way to go see movies.
Yeah.
And you have a much cleaner, less rot movie going experience about should I go see this and will I make time for it? Like, just go. Like, if it's interesting to you, just go and don't care what the critics say. Because the other thing here is like Paul Blart 2 getting a 30% is a much different 30% than After the Hunt getting 30%, because Paul Blart 2 is a very like, this movie is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
After the Hunt this is a very complex story about hard to discuss thing, and there's a lot of ambiguity into it. So it's not going to get like a fucking 80-90%. So when it gets a 30%, it just means something different than what Paul Blart 2 does. And it's a thing that's hard to see on Rotten Tomatoes.
Totally agree. All right, that's it for me. Max and I, we're going to be back with another episode next week, back to our regularly scheduled program. But thank you all for listening to the rant, and we will see you at the movies.
See you at the movies, y'all. Go see After the Hunt.